In 1863, a Union private soaked a cracker in his coffee until the weevils floated to the top, skimmed them off with a spoon, and called it breakfast. 25 years later, a cavalry trooper in Dakota Territory sat down to canned oysters and mince pie while the wind outside hit 40 below. Between those two suppers lies the strangest food story this country ever produced. Number 12 was so prized that men gambled a month's pay for a single tin. Number 7 fed entire regiments and disappeared with the herds that provided it. And number 3 broke teeth, started arguments, and won a war anyway. We are counting down 30 U.S. Army field suppers from the Civil War to the last frontier fort. Let's begin with number 30. Number 30, desiccated vegetables arrived in Union camps as bricks of compressed cabbage, turnips, carrots, and beets, dried hard as shingle and shipped by the ton after 1862. Surgeons championed them because scurvy was thinning regiments faster than any battle line. Men dropped a chunk into boiling water and watched it swell into a gray-green mass with the texture of wet rope. Soldiers renamed the ration almost immediately. Desecrated vegetables, they called it, and the joke traveled every corps in the Army. Diaries record fishing stems, straw, and unidentified fibers out of the pot before eating. Boiled with salt pork and cornmeal, it became almost tolerable. It was America's first industrial-scale attempt to preserve a vegetable, and it kept thousands upright. Almost nobody remembered it kindly. Number 29, Erbswurst came late, a German invention adopted by American quartermasters testing rations for frontier columns after the 1870s. Pea flour, bacon fat, salt, and onion were pressed into a hard, sausage-shaped bar, sliced off in coins, and stirred into hot water until it thickened into a yellow-green soup. One bar could feed several men and weighed almost nothing in a saddlebag, which was the entire point on a scouting expedition where every ounce rode on a mule's back. Troopers described a flavor that was salty, smoky, and strangely comforting after a day in the saddle. Officers praised the efficiency. Enlisted men called it pea sausage and ate it because a hot bowl of anything beat a cold cracker at midnight on the high plains. Number 28, lobscouse came up from the sailing navy and settled into Army messes wherever a company had a kettle and leftovers. Hardtack was broken with a rifle butt, soaked until it surrendered, then simmered with salt beef, whatever potatoes the sutler carried, and a fistful of onion. The starch from the crackers thickened everything into a heavy gray stew that held a spoon upright. Company cooks argued over the ratio. Too much cracker and it turned to paste, too little and it was salt water with meat in it. Regimental diaries from the Eastern Theater mention lobscouse on wet nights when the wood was too damp to fry anything. It was not good. It was hot, filling, and it stayed with you until morning. Number 27. Skilly-gally was the single most common thing a Union soldier actually cooked. Hardtack was soaked in water until soft, then dropped into a skillet of sizzling salt pork fat and fried until the edges browned and curled. The transformation was remarkable. A cracker that could break a molar became golden, crisp, and rich with pork flavor. Every man carried a half canteen hammered flat into a pan for exactly this purpose. The smell of frying grease drifted through camps at dusk from Virginia to Tennessee, thousands of small fires doing the same thing at the same hour. Veterans writing decades later still describe skilly-gally with something close to affection. It cost nothing extra, used what they already had, and made a hard ration feel like supper. Number 26. Hardtack pudding was the dessert of an army that had no business having dessert. Crackers were pounded to coarse flour in a haversack with a musket butt, mixed with water into a stiff dough, then studded with dried apples or whatever the sutler was selling. Some men rolled it flat, smeared it with molasses or brown sugar, rolled it up like a jelly roll, and boiled it in a cloth. Others fried the whole thing in pork grease and poured sweetened water over the top. Letters home describe men who had not tasted sugar in weeks, eating with a kind of reverence. $1's worth of molasses from the regimental sutler could turn a company's ration into a celebration that lasted about 4 minutes. Number 25. Cush was the Confederate answer to the same problem, and it followed the same logic with different ingredients. Bacon or beef was fried in a skillet until the fat rendered, then cornbread was crumbled in, sometimes with a little water, and the whole thing was stirred over the fire until it browned into a thick hash. Southern regiments ate cush on the march, out of the pan, standing up, passing the skillet down the line. The name came from the older Southern kitchen tradition of cornmeal mush, and the dish traveled straight from the farm to the field. Veterans remembered it as the taste of the campaign itself, hot fat and corn and smoke, eaten fast because the column was already moving. Number 24. Corn dodgers were survival food shaped by hand. Cornmeal, water, salt, and if you were lucky, a spoon of grease worked into oblong lumps and either baked on a hot flat rock, fried in a skillet, or dropped straight into the ashes at the fire's edge. They came out dense, gritty, and hard enough to survive a week in a haversack, which was the entire virtue. Confederate commissary records lean heavily on cornmeal because the South had corn and could not get wheat. Union troops in the Western Theater learned the trick from foraging through Tennessee and Georgia. A dodger softened in coffee or gravy. A dodger dry was a chore. Either way, it filled the corner of a stomach that nothing else was going to fill. Number 23. Fried mush was breakfast wherever cornmeal outran flour. The night before, a cook boiled meal and water into a thick porridge, poured it into a pan, and let it set overnight in the cold. By morning, it had firmed into a solid block that could be sliced like bread. Those slices went into hot bacon fat and came out crisp on the outside, soft and steaming in the middle, and if there was molasses in camp, the day started well. Frontier post kitchens ran this routine for decades because it stretched a cheap ration into 2 meals and wasted nothing. Soldiers who grew up on farms recognized it instantly. It tasted like home, which on a January morning at a Plains fort was worth more than the calories. Number 22. Chicory and parched corn coffee tell the story of Confederate scarcity better than any battlefield map. When the blockade choked off real beans, Southern soldiers roasted chicory root, rye, parched corn, sweet potato slices, peanuts, and even acorns, ground them fine, and boiled the result until it ran black. It fooled nobody. Letters home described the brew as bitter, thin, and vaguely of burnt earth, but men drank it scalding anyway because the ritual mattered as much as the stimulant. Captured Union coffee became one of the most valuable trophies of the war, traded across picket lines for tobacco in informal truces that officers pretended not to notice. Nothing revealed how much an army ran on habit quite like a cup of fake coffee. Number 21. Salt horse was the beef that came in barrels, cured so heavily in brine that it arrived at camp the color of mahogany and roughly the texture of harness leather. Regulations allowed 20 ounces of salted beef per man per day, but the salt had to come out before anything could go in. Cooks soaked it overnight, sometimes changing the water 3 times, occasionally dragging the whole chunk behind a wagon in a stream. What emerged went into the kettle with beans or crackers and simmered for hours. Soldiers joked that the barrels contained horseshoes and harness buckles, and a few swore they found evidence. It was the least loved meat in the Army and one of the most reliable because it kept when nothing else did. Number 20. Slumgullion had no recipe, which was the definition of the dish. Whatever a company happened to possess went into one kettle. Salt pork, a handful of rice, some beans, a stolen potato, a scrap of onion, hardtack crumbs to thicken it, and water enough to stretch it across every man in the mess. The color was uniformly brown. The flavor changed nightly depending on the fortunes of the foraging party. Western soldiers and later frontier troopers used the word for any improvised catch-all stew, and it spread from the Army into mining camps and cattle outfits across the West. Diaries record it as either the worst meal of the week or the best, and both entries were sometimes written by the same man. Number 19. Mulligan stew was slumgullion with organization. In garrison and in long field camps, messes pooled their individual rations into one pot under a designated cook, and suddenly 6 men eating separately became 6 men eating well. The beef ration went in first, then beans, rice, dried vegetables, and whatever the company garden or the post trader supplied. It simmered for hours over low coals while men cleaned equipment and wrote letters. Frontier accounts describe the smell drifting across the parade ground in the late afternoon, a signal as reliable as a bugle call. The lesson was old and practical. Rations divided 30 ways made 30 poor suppers. Rations combined made one good one, and morale followed the kettle. Number 18. Army bean soup earned a permanent place in American military tradition, and it started with a hole in the ground. Navy beans were soaked, then buried in a cast iron pot over hot coals with a chunk of salt pork covered with earth and left to cook slowly for hours or overnight. What came out was thick, smoky, and shot through with soft pork fat, the beans holding their shape but yielding completely. Union regulations issued beans by the court per 100 rations, making them one of the most dependable items in the supply chain. Veterans of both the war and the frontier campaigns wrote about bean soup with genuine warmth. It was cheap, it kept men working, and it tasted like something a mother might have made. Number 17. Sourdough biscuits ran the frontier army in a way regulations never acknowledged. Company cooks kept a crock of starter alive through winters that froze ink in inkwells, feeding it flour and water, sleeping with it near the stove on the coldest nights so the culture would not die. That starter produced biscuits that rose without commercial yeast, baked in a Dutch oven buried in coals, and came out tall, tangy, and golden. Troopers called them dough gods. On a march across Wyoming or Montana territory, a hot biscuit split and filled with bacon was the high point of the day. Lose your starter and you were back to hard bread, which is why cooks guarded their crocks with a jealousy usually reserved for whiskey. Number 16. Flapjacks turned a flour ration into an occasion. Company cooks mixed flour, water, salt, and a little grease, sometimes borrowing sourdough starter or a spoon of saleratus for lift, and poured the batter into a skillet slick with bacon fat. They came off the fire brown, chewy at the edges, and vanished as fast as they could be made. Molasses was the crowning touch when the sutler had it, and men lined up with tin plates while the cook worked without pause. Frontier diaries record slapjack breakfasts before long patrols because they sat heavy and lasted. There is something in the accounts that goes beyond food. Soldiers far from home describe standing near the fire, waiting their turn, and feeling, briefly, ordinary. Number 15. Dried apple duff was the sweet reward of the frontier post. Dried apple slices were soaked until they plumped back into something like fruit, then folded into a stiff flour dough with sugar and spice if the trader had any, tied in a cloth and boiled for hours over the fire. The result was dense, sticky, and warm all the way through, sliced thick, and eaten with a thin sauce of sugar and water. Quartermaster shipments to western posts listed dried apples in quantity because they survived months in a freight wagon without spoiling. Officers' wives writing from Fort Laramie and Fort Union described duff appearing on tables at the end of hard weeks, its arrival predicting good spirits in the barracks the next morning. Number 14. Canned oyster stew belongs to the strangest chapter of frontier eating. By the 1870s, tinned oysters from the Chesapeake and Gulf were riding railroads and freight wagons to army posts 1,000 miles from saltwater. A tin was opened, emptied into a pot with milk if the post dairy herd was producing, or water if it was not, thickened with a little flour, seasoned with pepper and butter, and served scalding with hardtack broken into it. Post-trader ledgers show oysters selling briskly at prices that made officers wince. For men who had not seen an ocean in years, the taste was pure novelty. Company celebrations, promotions, and holidays all began with somebody producing a tin from a footlocker. Number 13. Canned peaches sat at the top of every soldier's list of luxuries, and every post-trader knew it. The tin came off the shelf, heavy and cold, punched open with a bayonet, and the syrup alone was worth the price. Men drank it straight from the can before touching the fruit. Trader ledgers from Western Post show peaches priced far above their eastern cost, freight charges being what they were, and troopers paid anyway out of $13 a month. Accounts describe a can shared between 4 men, each getting a slice and a swallow of syrup passed around a stove in a barracks in February. In a world of salt and cornmeal and grease, a peach was color, sweetness, and proof that somewhere else existed. Number 12. Company gardens were the quiet triumph of the frontier army. Post commanders ordered troops to break ground in the spring and plant potatoes, onions, cabbage, turnips, beans, and radishes, sometimes miles from the fort where the water was better. Soldiers grumbled about farming in uniform, then ate the results all winter. Surgeons' reports connect the gardens directly to falling scurvy rates because the ration alone could not prevent it, and the supply line was too long to fix it. Potatoes and onions were the prize crops, stored in root cellars dug into hillsides. A plate of fresh boiled potatoes with butter in October after a summer of salt pork appears in more than one diary as the best meal of the entire year. Number 11. Wild greens filled the gap the gardens could not. Soldiers who grew up on farms recognized what was growing outside the palisade, and in spring they went after it. Dandelion, lamb's quarters, wild onion, watercress from creek beds. Poke shoots gathered young, and prairie turnips learned from the tribes and traders who had been eating them for centuries. Boiled with a scrap of bacon, the greens went onto tin plates alongside the usual ration. Post surgeons encouraged the practice openly because it worked. Scurvy retreated when the greens came in. Regimental medical records treat a spring salad as a prescription, and the men eating it did not need convincing. After a winter of salt meat, anything green tasted like recovery. Number 10. Jackrabbit and sage hen supplemented the plains ration whenever a soldier could get a shot off. Jackrabbit was lean to the point of being difficult, so cooks stewed it long with bacon fat and flour to add what the animal lacked. Sage hen, the plains grouse, carried a strong, resinous flavor from the sagebrush it fed on, and troopers either loved it or buried it. Hunting parties went out from post across Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana territory, with official blessing because fresh meat was fresh meat. Diaries record the arrival of a full game bag as a small holiday in the barracks. The cook took over, the kettle went on, and for one night the mess smelled like something other than pork. Number 9. Antelope and venison stew were the closest thing the frontier army had to a proper roast dinner. Pronghorn ranged across the high plains in numbers that astonished Eastern soldiers, and a successful hunt could feed a company. The meat was lean, dark, and slightly sweet, and cooks knew better than to hurry it. It went into the kettle with onions, potatoes from the garden, wild sage, and enough bacon to supply the fat the animal did not have, then simmered until it fell apart. Officers' wives at Western Post wrote out venison recipes and traded them in letters east. Men who had eaten salt pork for 6 straight weeks described the first bowl of antelope stew with the kind of detail people usually save for weddings. Number 8. Buffalo hump and tongue were the great delicacies of the plains, and the Army knew it before the Eastern public did. Hunters targeted the hump ribs, marbled and tender, and the tongue, which was so prized that it commanded prices in Eastern markets and appeared on restaurant menus in Chicago and New York. Soldiers roasted hump ribs over open fires on the trail, the fat dripping and hissing into the coals, and simmered tongues for hours until they could be peeled and sliced cold. Accounts from campaigns across Kansas and Nebraska describe men eating until they could not stand. Within a generation, the herds were gone, and the meal that defined Army life on the plains disappeared with them entirely. Number 7. Fresh beef on the hoof was the supply system nobody talks about. Contractors drove herds to army posts and to columns in the field, and the animals walked to the meal rather than being shipped to it. When a beef was issued, the whole company reorganized around it. Cuts were distributed by lot, so nobody could accuse the sergeant of favoritism, and the good pieces went straight to the fire, while the tough ones went into the kettle for the next day. Regulations allowed a fresh beef ration on a set rotation, and men counted the days. The difference between salt pork and a piece of beef cooked the same afternoon it was killed was, in the words of one trooper, the difference between duty and living. Number 6. Son of a Gun Stew came out of the same butchering day and used everything the good cuts left behind. Heart, liver, sweetbreads, kidney, tongue, and the marrow gut all went into a single pot with onions, salt, and pepper and simmered for hours until the whole thing turned rich and thick. The dish traveled between cattle outfits and army camps across Texas and the southern plains, and the recipe was passed by demonstration rather than writing. Cowboys and troopers alike gave it names too colorful to print. What nobody disputed was the result. Cooked properly and slowly, it produced the deepest, most satisfying flavor available anywhere on the frontier, and it came from the parts everyone else discarded. Number 5. Sobely, the salt pork ration, was the daily anchor of American soldiering for 30 years. Regulations issued 12 ounces per man per day, packed in barrels of brine, and shipped everywhere the flag went. It arrived white, streaked, and aggressively salty, and it did everything. Sliced thin and fried, it was breakfast. Its rendered fat cooked the hardtack, the mush, the flapjacks, and the greens. The lean end flavored the beans. Soldiers complained about it constantly and would have collapsed without it. Diaries describe men chewing raw slices on the march because there was no time to build a fire. When veterans wrote memoirs decades later, Sobely appeared on nearly every page, remembered without affection and without exception. Number 4. Hardtack was 3 inches square, half an inch thick, made of flour, water, and salt, and baked until every trace of moisture was gone. 9 or 10 crackers made a day's bread ration. Soldiers named it Tooth Duller, Sheet Iron Cracker, and Worm Castle. The last one earned honestly, because barrels warehoused since the Mexican War arrived infested. Men learned to break it into coffee and skim the surface. They fried it, boiled it, powdered it, and made pudding from it. Whole campaigns were fought on nothing else. Its virtue was absolute. It did not spoil, did not need cooking, and could ride in a haversack for a month. An army that could not be fed hot could still be fed hardtack, and that changed how far it could march. Number 3. The Christmas dinner at a frontier fort was the one meal of the year that broke every rule. Officers' wives, laundresses, and company cooks planned for weeks. Hunting parties went out for antelope, deer, and wild turkey. The post trader emptied his shelves of canned oysters, dried fruit, sugar, and spices at prices nobody argued over. Tables in the mess hall carried roast game, oyster stew, mashed potatoes from the company garden, hot rolls from the bakery, mince pie, and dried apple duff heavy with molasses. Letters from posts across Dakota and Arizona Territory described the room warm, the stove roaring, and men who had spent the year on patrol laughing together for one evening. It was homesickness answered with food, and it worked. Number 2, soft bread from the post bakery was the single greatest morale item in the frontier army, and commanders understood this completely. Every established fort built a bakery and detailed men to it, and the ovens ran through the night so that loaves came out warm at reveille. Regulations allowed 18 ounces of soft bread per man where a bakery existed, and where one did not, the men got hard crackers instead and knew exactly what they were missing. Diaries record the smell reaching the barracks before dawn. Troopers returning from weeks in the field wrote about the first warm slice with butter as the moment they felt they had actually come home. Bread was ordinary everywhere else in America. Out there, it was proof of civilization. Number 1, Coffee ran the United States Army. Union regulations issued green beans by the pound per 100 rations, and every man roasted, crushed, and boiled his own, using a rifle butt, a rock, or a tin cup as a mortar. Some carbines were even fitted with grinders. It was drunk at 3 in the morning before a march, at midday in the heat, and at midnight on picket. Men traded tobacco for it across enemy lines. Frontier troopers boiled it thick enough to stand a spoon in and drank it scalding from tin cups that burned their lips. It carried no nutrition worth counting, and it was the most important item in the haversack. Coffee was warmth, alertness, ritual, and the closest thing to comfort a soldier could carry. From desiccated vegetables to a tin cup of coffee at dawn, these 30 suppers trace a country feeding its army across half a continent and 30 years of change. The pattern never varied. Salt, grease, corn, and whatever the land would surrender, transformed by men with a skillet and no other options. Every trick on this list existed because somebody was hungry and improvised. Which one surprised you most? And which one would you actually eat? Tell me in the comments, and if there is a field ration you think belonged on this list, I want to hear about it.